Hello and welcome to week 6 of the review of Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche's teachings on Samantabhadra's King of Aspiration Prayers, the Pranidhana Raja. This week we're going to cover verses 28 to 35, which together comprise the 11th of the 16 aspirations. This one's called Aspiration to the Different Methods for Entering into the Good Actions. And this refers to the view, meditation and action of bodhisattvas on the first bhumi and beyond. The title for this week is Insight, referring to the direct experience of non-duality that the bodhisattva attains on the path of seeing, in other words, the first bhumi. And this week's image is of an infinite and interconnected array of enlightened beings and pure realms, reflecting the first bhumi bodhisattva's inconceivable vision and boundless aspirations to benefit all sentient beings across time and space. So before we begin, let's take a moment to tune our motivation and aspire to spend this time together so that it might benefit all beings. So in this week's verses, there's a couple of key themes. The first is one we've already touched on, which is pure perception. And Rinpoche says, you need to think that on a single atom, on the surface of a single atom, there are Buddhas as many as the atoms in the universe, right at this very moment. And so for most of us, this inconceivable vision is not merely beyond our current perception of the world, but it's also quite different from the way we might understand or relate to the Buddha. So how might we understand this? We can perhaps relate to prostrating and making offerings to a statue of the Buddha in a sacred place like the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya. But what does it mean to make offerings and prayers to the Buddha if there are countless numbers of Buddhas on top of every single atom? We'll explore this question, supplementing Rinpoche's commentary on the Pranidhana Raja with extracts from his teachings on Buddha nature in the Uttara Tantra Shastra. Another key theme this week is the two truths. And here we'll go through Rinpoche's introduction to the two truths using the example of having a nightmare of falling from a 26-story building. Okay, so let's turn to the verses. First, verses 28 and 29, which have the title Seeing the Buddhas and Their Pure Realms. In a single atom, may I see as many pure realms as atoms in the universe, and in each realm, Buddhas beyond all imagining, encircled by all their bodhisattva heirs. Along with them, may I perform the actions of enlightenment. And so, in each direction, everywhere, even on the tip of a hair, may I see an ocean of Buddhas, all to come in past, present, and future, in an ocean of pure realms. And throughout an ocean of aeons, may I enter into enlightened action in each and every one. So, this is quite inconceivable, right? On top of each atom, there is a number of Buddhas equal to all the atoms in the universe. And I'm going to look at these Buddhas, gaze at them, and emulate them for ocean-like aeons. And here Rinpoche said, it's not that you're going to see, or that you're making the aspiration to see in the future, but rather that you need to have the confidence that you are looking at the Buddha and seeing the Buddhas right here, right now. So in this context, it's wrong to think that the Buddha passed into nirvana 2,500 years ago. It's not right to think that bodhisattvas such as Manjushri or Avalokiteshvara exist somewhere in the universe, and that if we practice and recite prayers, then one day we'll be able to encounter them. As he said, this is a wrong way of thinking, a wrong attitude. It's also wrong to think there's just one Buddha, like the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. We have to think that on a single atom, on the surface of a single atom, there are Buddhas as many as the atoms in the universe, right at this very moment. And not only are there Buddhas, infinite Buddhas on a single atom, but they're surrounded by infinite bodhisattvas. And I'm going to see them and look at them this very moment. So Rinpoche said we need to have confidence, which raises the question, what is the meaning of confidence as compared to blind faith? We might also ask, what is the correct understanding of devotion in the Vajrayana? which is certainly not meant to be like the romantic crush of a devoted teenager. And this is one central point where secular Buddhists misunderstand Buddhism, especially Vajrayana. But it's also one of the central points where Buddhists, especially Vajrayana Buddhists, can misunderstand the Buddha and the Guru, and thereby create obstacles for their own path and practice. So in reaching this confidence, there are at least two important steps. Firstly, we need to establish the basis for our confidence. And here we go back to the example we've used in previous weeks of the dirty window. And the confidence is that we can clean the window because although there is dirt on the window, the dirt is not the nature of the window. This also means, of course, that our current perception of a dirty window is not the window as it truly is. Our current impure perceptions are not seeing things as they truly are. The Tibetan word for relative truth, kunzop, has this connotation of obscured. The dirt is obscuring the truth. And there's something, I think, lost in the English translation of the word relative truth. So first we need to establish the basis for our confidence, right, that it is justified. But secondly, we need to accept the difficulty, indeed the impossibility, of saying anything about the clean window. In other words, the countless Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the non-dual awareness, the nature of mind, or even enlightenment itself. The teachings tell us that all this is beyond thought and language, beyond our conceptual minds. But nevertheless, we need to find ways to talk about it so that we can teach, we can inspire students. So we need a finger pointing at the moon. And of course, we also need to know the finger isn't the moon. So this example is now part of popular culture, as spoken by Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon, the famous 1973 movie, where there's a scene where he says, "It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger, or you will miss all the heavenly glory." Now, this example actually comes from the Mahayana Sutras. For example, the Shurangama Sutra, where the Buddha told Ananda, "You still listen to the Dharma with conditioned mind, and so the Dharma becomes conditioned as well, and you do not obtain the Dharma nature. It is like when someone points his finger at the moon to show it to someone else. Guided by the finger, that person should see the moon. But if he looks at the finger instead and mistakes it for the moon, he loses not only the moon, but also the finger. Why? Because he mistakes the pointing finger for the bright moon." There's another one, Lankavatara Sutra. "As the ignorant grasp the fingertip and not the moon, so those who cling to the letter know not my truth." So yes, the challenge is that the moon, enlightenment, is beyond words and concepts, and unlike the actual moon, we cannot talk about it or describe it or show pictures of it. And yet we know our aim is Buddhahood and enlightenment for self and all beings, so we need to find a way to talk about it, to visualize it, so that beginners are inspired to go on the journey, but also so they have a sense of the right direction to go in. We need a finger so that we can point at the moon. And so we talk about form is emptiness and emptiness is form. In other words, emptiness is fullness, or as we see in this week, the infinite possibility of limitless Buddhas. And it's not that Buddhas or indeed deities are the only way for us to see this fullness. And Tibetan iconography is obviously just one very particular way of visualizing Buddhas and deities. But we have this important twofold point. Firstly, to accept that our ordinary way of seeing and understanding is obscured, and secondly, to find representations that are inspiring and aspirational, even though they're not true. And what makes these verses 28 and 29 about seeing the Buddhas even more challenging is that now we're talking about the Sambhogakaya and not just the Nimanakaya. So let me spend a moment on this. So remember last week we talked about verse 25, which was, "May I always behold the Buddhas here before my eyes, and around them all their bodhisattva sons and daughters, without ever tiring, throughout all the aeons to come. May the offerings I make them be endless and vast." And here the commentaries note that that verse, 25, was about the way that bodhisattvas, who are still ordinary beings, they're not yet on the first bhumi, how they view the array of the supreme emanation bodies, in other words, the Nirmanakaya and their fields. Whereas this verse, 28, is about how the Arya bodhisattvas, in other words, those on the bhumis, view the array of complete enjoyment bodies and their fields, in other words, the Sambhogakaya. And the difference in meaning is substantial, even though at first glance the verses sound very similar. So here's verse 28 once again. In a single atom may I see as many pure realms as atoms in the universe, and in each realm Buddhas beyond all imagining, encircled by all their bodhisattva heirs. Along with them may I perform the actions of enlightenment. So for us to understand this difference, let's talk a little more about the three kayas. In Mahayana Buddhism, the three kayas are the three aspects or dimensions of a fully enlightened being or Buddha. So first the Dharmakaya, which literally means the truth body. And this is the ultimate nature of reality itself, beyond conceptualization. It represents the absolute or unmanifested aspect of enlightenment. Dharmakaya is often described as the essence of Buddhahood, beyond form and characteristics. And secondly, Sambhogakaya, which means enjoyment body. And this is the aspect of the body Buddha that appears in a subtle form to highly realized beings such as bodhisattvas in higher realms, or to beings in pure realms, such as Amitabha's pure realm of Sukhavati. Sambhogakaya embodies the blissful aspect of enlightenment and serves as a source of inspiration and guidance for practitioners. And third, we have the Nirmanakaya, or emanation body. And this is the physical or manifest form of the Buddha, as exemplified by historical Buddhas such as Gautama Buddha. The Nirmanakaya represents the Buddha's appearance in the world for the benefit of sentient beings, which includes the historical Buddha Shakyamuni and other Buddhas who appear in various forms to teach and guide beings. Now I want to compare this view with some other traditions in Buddhism. So for example, in the Theravada, generally the Theravada does not emphasize or really speak about the concept of three kayas in the same way as Mahayana. Instead, the Theravada teachings focus on the realization of nirvana as a cessation of suffering through insight into the impermanent and non-self nature of phenomena. Secular Buddhism likewise talks almost not at all about the three kayas, but when it does, it's explained in terms of analogies with practical wisdom and psychological insights. Dharmakaya may be understood as fundamental principles underlying human experience and the nature of physical reality. Sambhogakaya is the subjective experience of joy and well-being, and Nirmanakaya is the embodiment of wisdom and compassion in human form. But I also want to talk briefly about the Mahamudra and Dzogchen perspective, and admittedly completely beyond the Mahayana view of these teachings, but I want to include it for completeness, and also because Rinpoche uses these terms when he teaches in different ways on different occasions. So here, the Dharmakaya is understood as the ultimate nature of mind, which is empty, luminous, and free from conceptual elaboration. It is the ground or basis from which all phenomena arise and dissolve. A Dharmakaya is not seen as a separate entity or state to be attained, but rather as the inherent nature of our own minds, which is already present and accessible. The Sambhogakaya is understood as the spontaneous manifestation of the enlightened qualities and activities of the Buddhas. It is the natural expression of wisdom, compassion, and skillful means that arises from the Dharmakaya. Sambhogakaya is not limited to specific celestial or pure realms, but is present in every moment of experience as the luminous display of awareness. And finally, Nirmanakaya. In Mahamudra and Dzogchen, the Nirmanakaya is understood as the dynamic manifestation of enlightened activity within the world. It's the expression of wisdom and compassion in response to the needs and conditions of sentient beings. It's not limited to historical Buddhas or specific emanations, but includes the spontaneous activity of all awakened beings, including practitioners who realize their true nature. So, in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, it is considered possible for practitioners to directly see or experience or realize the three kayas in this life, and the practices in those traditions are aimed at directly realizing the nature of mind, which is understood to be inseparable from the three kayas. Okay, so back to the verses 28 and 29 and their aspiration to see countless Buddhas in pure realms. How might these be understood differently depending on our view? So in the Mahayana, seeing countless Buddhas in pure realms in every direction reflects the core Mahayana view of the ultimate reality of emptiness, which is Dhammakaya, the dynamic expression of wisdom and compassion with the Sambhogakaya, and the skillful manifestation of enlightened activity in the Manakaya. The aspiration to perform enlightened actions in each realm aligns with the Mahayana ideals of bodhisattva activity and compassionate engagement for the benefit of all beings. In the Theravada, these verses might be interpreted more metaphorically or aspirationally, rather than as literal manifestations of Buddhas in pure realms. For example, they might be understood as an expression of devotion and inspiration, encouraging practitioners to aspire towards wholesome qualities and cessation of suffering. And although the concept of three kayas is not explicitly emphasized in the Theravada, these verses could still be seen as expressing aspirations for spiritual growth and liberation. In secular Buddhism, these verses might be approached as poetic inspirations of universal human aspirations for peace, wisdom, compassion. They could be seen as reflections of the potential for goodness and enlightenment within human experience, encouraging ethical living and compassionate action in a secular context. And the aspiration to perform enlightened actions could be understood as a commitment to personal growth and contributing to the well-being of others, regardless of religious or metaphysical beliefs. And as we've seen in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, these verses might be understood as pointing to the innate purity and luminosity of mind, where the perception of countless Buddhas in pure realms arises naturally from the recognition of the empty and luminous nature of reality. They could be seen as expressions of the natural state of awareness, where phenomena are perceived as inseparable from the empty and luminous nature of mind. And the aspiration to enter into enlightened action in each realm could be understood as an expression of spontaneous, compassionate activity, again arising from the natural state of awareness. Now, there is some difference among Mahayana commentaries about the stage at which bodhisattvas can perceive the Sambhogakaya directly. The most common view is that the bodhisattvas perceive the Sambhogakaya from the 8th bhumi onwards. This stage is called the immovable or achala, because bodhisattvas who reach this level are no longer subject to backsliding in their spiritual attainments. But in other commentaries, it's sometimes said that already from the 1st bhumi, bodhisattvas can have glimpses or partial perceptions of the Sambhogakaya, especially during profound meditative states or through the blessings of higher beings. These perceptions, however, are typically not as complete or continuous as they would be from the 8th bhumi onwards. And as we just noted, the three kayas are understood differently in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions, but outside those traditions it's generally considered impossible for ordinary beings like us to experience the Sambhogakaya, which makes all of these verses very difficult to talk about and to understand. And at this stage, as Rinpoche has often said, what we can do and what we should do is aspire. Hence, we recite the Pranidhana Raja. Okay, so verse 30, the second topic, which is listening to the speech of the Buddhas. Each single word of a Buddha's speech, that voice with its ocean of qualities, bears all the purity of the speech of all the Buddhas, sounds that harmonize with the minds of all living beings. May I always be engaged with the speech of the Buddhas. And here Rinpoche said, this is saying, I will listen to ocean-like teachings with their ocean-like melodies, and with my ocean-like determination I shall enter into their words. When these Tathagatas turn the wheel of the Dharma, I shall not only listen and hear their teachings, but I shall enter into these teachings with the power of my wisdom, and I shall not enter into them only in this time, but even the Buddhas of the future, I shall enter their speech within one moment. Okay, next, verse 31. Hearing the turning of the wheel of Dharma. With all the power of my mind, may I hear and realize the inexhaustible melody of the teachings spoken by all the Buddhas of the past, present, and future as they turn the wheels of Dharma. And so here Rinpoche said that just as verse 30, the previous verse, was hearing the words, this verse is about understanding the meaning, the unmixed characteristics of the meaning of the words of the Buddha. So when we talk about entering into the meaning of the Buddha's speech, and especially the speech of the Buddhas as understood by the Bodhisattvas on the first bhumi and beyond, this may seem to us as characterized by inconceivability and paradox. As Rinpoche said, while we're on the path of aspiring conduct, in other words, before the first bhumi, we're not able to enter into the speech of the Buddhas. It's not just that we have limited views and sectarian attitudes, but that we easily get confused when we hear seemingly contradictory teachings. For example, sometimes the Buddha says things like, "At one time I was a monkey," as if to indicate there is a self that continues over multiple rebirths. And at other times he teaches there is no self. In other words, he teaches both ultimate and relative truths. And here Rinpoche said, the two truths, like the three kayas, are not understood as separate, but the challenge is that we only have one mouth, so that we have to talk about them one at a time. And he also said, during many of the questions and answers in the Vancouver teachings in 2024, that this is the main source of confusion and questions for young bodhisattvas like us as we try to make sense of the grand Mahayana view. So how might we connect to inconceivability? Well, of course, we continue to make the aspirations, such as the Pranidhana Raja. But Rinpoche has also suggested that we might be able to relate to the body, speech, and mind of the Buddhas in very basic and practical ways. For example, he's suggested some things that practitioners might do. For example, we could copy sutras, buy a copy of the text of the Vajracchedika Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and copy it by hand. Or volunteer. He suggested doing at least 50 hours of voluntary work to benefit others, and really try not to have your name acknowledged for what you're doing. You should have no recognition. This is an important way to get used to the actions of the Bodhisattva. Even something as simple as when you see garbage, pick it up, even though you might know this is endless. Or, as he said, spend at least 100 hours cleaning a place that houses the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha, for example, a temple or a Dharma center. Finally, pilgrimage. Go on pilgrimage to Buddhist holy places like Bodh Gaya, or Vulture's Peak, or Nalanda University, or the sacred Buddhist mountains in China like Imeshan and Wutaishan. So these are just examples of ways that even if the inconceivable body, speech, and mind of the Buddha feel beyond us, we can start to relate to them. Okay, verse 32, which is about entering into all the aeons. Just as the wisdom of the Buddhas penetrates all future aeons, so may I too know them instantly, and in each fraction of an instant may I know all that will ever be in past, present, and future. So here we're making the aspiration and commitment to enter into the ocean of future ages and future aeons right now, this very moment. And also making the commitment to enter into all the past and present and future aeons this very moment. Now, when you hear this, you might think it's some inconceivable magic or miracle. But Rinpoche said, if we think deeply, we can understand that time, our conception of past, present, and future, is just a fabrication of our conceptual mind. And if we can do this, it's not necessarily inconceivable to be able to digest this kind of concept. Although, of course, that's on an ultimate level. Because on a relative level, as Rinpoche said when teaching Madhyamika, if you were to ask the great Madhyamika masters like Nagarjuna and Dzongsar Khyentse for a glass of water, they're going to give you a glass of water. They're not going to say there is no glass, there is no water, and so forth. So when teaching this in Bodh Gaya in 2023, Rinpoche told a story about his trip to Mongolia. He said he was recently visiting Mongolia and they put him up in a hotel. And in the morning when he went for breakfast, there was a line of dishes lined up for breakfast. And among this line of food, they also had unique Mongolian food. And he said usually he's not really keen on taking breakfast, but Mongolian food includes Tibetan butter tea, and he really likes Tibetan tea. So for a few days, Rinpoche deliberately went for breakfast and drank butter tea, Tibetan salted tea. And with the tea, he also ate Mongolian bread, which is like Tibetan bread, putting butter and cheese in between the slices of this Mongolian bread. And then one day, the young Mongolian guy from the hotel said to him, "You must really like this Tibetan food, like horse's milk and horse butter." And he said, I personally don't like horse butter and milk. And Rinpoche said, "The moment I heard this, I felt nausea the whole day. And from the next day, I couldn't even turn my face towards this kid. I realized I have this dualistic clinging or distinction of liking cow's milk and not liking horse's milk. And perhaps feeling disgust or revulsion towards horse's milk might be due to a habit that I carry from childhood or even from past lives. And likewise, at this moment, most of us have a very strong grasping and clinging towards time, to past, present, and future. And we suppose that if time tomorrow or the future was cancelled, then for us it would be like drinking horse's milk." Okay, so back to the verses. So this group of the first 5 verses here, 28 to 32, is all about engaging with the enlightened qualities and activities of the Buddhas through the strength of non-dual wisdom or yogic direct cognition. And these are not things we can comprehend directly, but 28 and 29 are about the body of the Buddha. Verse 30 is about the speech, 31 is about the mind, and 32 is about the quality and activity. And these are the 5 key aspects of the Buddha that all need to be realized on the path. This is also another way to approach the inconceivability of emptiness and pure perception. So as we say in Vajrayana, pure perception of body is seeing all appearances as non-dual deity, which would correspond here to visualization of infinite and inconceivable Buddhas and Bodhisattvas on each atom. A pure perception of speech is hearing all sounds as non-dual mantra. And here in the Mahayana, this is, as Rinpoche said, like making sense of and being able to hold these teachings that are seemingly paradoxical and contradictory. And finally, the pure perception of mind is seeing all thoughts as non-dual wisdom. And that's like Rinpoche's example of going beyond all distinctions, like cow's milk and horse's milk, or about the concepts of past and present and future. Okay, so verse 33. And there's actually 2 headings here, first 2 lines and the last 2 lines. One is seeing all the Buddhas in one instant, which is the first 2, and the other is entering the sphere of activity of the Buddhas, which is the 3rd and 4th lines. "In an instant may I behold all those who are lions of the human race, the Buddhas of past, present, and future. May I always be engaged in the Buddha's way of life and action, through the power of liberation where all is realized as like an illusion." And so here Rinpoche talked about the importance of having relatable stories of these infinite displays of the Buddhas that ordinary beings can relate to. So here we're aspiring to see all the Buddhas and enter into their contact. But as ordinary beings, when we think about the Buddha, we can only really think about the Buddha in terms of a normal human being. The one that was alive 2,500 years ago in Magadha, holding a begging bowl, making the touching the earth mudra while he was sitting, peacefully and mindfully walking around, holding his begging bowl and begging for alms. Rinpoche said, he doesn't remember the name of the sutra, but there's one sutra telling a story about when Buddha talked to Bodhisattva Maitreya about Bodhisattva Manjushri. And Buddha invited Arya Maitreya to look at how Manjushri is walking, and he said to Maitreya, "The way Manjushri walks, how he lifts his feet and then places them on the ground again, can only be understood by a person who has unimaginable amounts of merit." So if we reflect on this, it would seem that the activity or conduct of the Buddha himself is truly unimaginable and beyond us, really beyond our imagination. The only aspect or version of the Buddha's conduct or activity that can fit into our mind is the traditional story of the Buddha's descent from Tushita heaven, taking birth in Lumbini, going through austerities and penance on the banks of the Narayanjana, and so on. Only that much can fit into our very small conceptual minds. So here in this Pranidhana Raja, we're making the commitment or aspiration, or indeed generating the confidence that we will see the activities and conduct of the Buddha as it is, through the power of knowing that everything is illusion. So going back to the example of cleaning the dirty window, we know that Buddha nature is primordially pure and completely stainless. We can say it's like a gold statue encased inside a mold of our emotions, obscurations and defilements. And the Buddha knows all these emotions and defilements are temporary. But in order to benefit sentient beings, in other words, to help them dismantle this mold, or indeed to clean the dirt on their windows, although the Buddhas have never moved from the original state of enlightenment, they manifest as if they have, just like Shakyamuni Buddha. So hence we talk of the Nirmanakaya, the manifestation, which is like a show put on for our benefit. So here I'm drawing from Rinpoche's teachings on the Uttara Tantra in 2003-2004 in Dordogne. He also said, in particular, the manifestation Buddhas like the Nirmanakaya are all tools of the path. And the path is there because of deluded beings. And of course, because ordinary beings like us are deluded, sublime beings can't be absolutely sublime, otherwise they would be beyond us, and there would be no possibility of communication between these sublime beings and those on the path. So they have to be somewhat related and relatable to us, with one nose, one face, and so on. This works better. And similarly, we can relate to things like them sleeping and yawning and walking. But at the same time, they can't be too ordinary, because then what's the point? They have to be somewhat special, perhaps with a blue color or 6 arms or things like that. And even the historical Buddha Shakyamuni supposedly had 32 major marks and 80 minor marks. So yes, these are related to ordinary things like having a tongue. But the Buddha's tongue was not ordinary, it's slightly beyond normal. It covered his whole face. So things like that are slightly beyond normal. And therefore the path is difficult. But as Rinpoche said, the difficulty is not because of the path, it's because of the person that walks on the path. And that's why it has to suit the needs of the person on the path. And at the same time, it should not negate or oppose the result. So this is why it's difficult. And this is why the sublime beings manifest to different kinds of sentient beings according to their different wishes and necessity. They know how to do that, right? Hence the Nirmanakaya. The Buddha knows what people need and what people want, which is why he is called in Tibetan Jigten Khenpa, right? The one who knows the world. And this is one of the most important qualities of the Buddha. In the Sutra of Remembering the Triple Gem, it says, he not only knows what people need and what they want, but he will also give them both of these. If he only gave people what they need to hear, then nobody would listen. And if he only gave people what they want to hear, there's no point. He would be useless, like a comedian or entertainer. So we talk of the show, the Nirmanakaya. What is the real show? The Buddha took rebirths as a rabbit, a monkey, a bird, and so on, until the last of rebirths as a god. At that time, his name in Sanskrit was Shvetaketu, which means white tip or white mark. His hair had a white tip jewel or something like that. And as Rinpoche said, Maitreya knew this very well, because this bodhisattva was the one who took off his crown and gave it to Maitreya, saying, I'm going to earth, leaving the god realm, entering Maya Devi's womb in the form of an ash-colored elephant with 6 tusks, and then after 9 months and 9 days being born in the garden of Lumbini, and studying the arts such as writing, reading, and warfare under various tutors. And don't forget, this is all a show. Yeah. Enjoying the courtesans and the queens, having a certain curiosity to leave the palace, seeing death and old age, asking his chariot driver, what are these things? Coming back, depressed, brooding, then escaping from the palace, searching for enlightenment. And for that, 6 years of penance, and then realizing that's not right and stopping penance, meeting Sujata the cowherd girl and a grass seller, and accepting offerings like grass, and going under the Bodhi tree, and in the evening defeating the Maras, and at dawn attaining enlightenment, and then not wanting to teach. And it's amazing. It's all a show. And what is the show for? It's for the benefit of sentient beings. The Buddha is giving us both what we want and what we need. Every action, every aspect of his show has a purpose. For example, when he didn't want to teach, what did that do? It caused sentient beings like the gods, Brahma and Indra, to come down from their heavenly realms and ask him to teach. And by doing so, they created merit. As Rinpoche said, this is amazing compassion. And so then the Buddha turns the wheel of the Dharma 3 times, and in the end, in Kushinagar, under the falling red blossoms from 2 stately sal trees, he passes into parinirvana. And that's how the show goes on, all the time, until the end of samsara. Okay, so verse 34, which is accomplishing and entering the Pure Lands. On a single atom may I actually bring about the entire array of pure realms of past, of present and future, and then enter into those pure Buddha realms, in each atom and in each and every direction. Now, many of these verses may feel quite similar, and indeed for us as beginners, they're all aspirational, since we can only handle the Theravada story of the Nirmanakaya Buddha, as we've just said. But let me just contrast some verses which feel very similar. So, verse 3 had, in every atom preside as many Buddhas as there are atoms, and around them all their bodhisattva heirs. And so I imagine them filling completely the entire space of reality. Yes, remember, this was during preparation, the 7 branch offering, and there our aspiration was to imagine them filling reality. Then last week, verse 25, on the path of aspirational conduct, right, still ordinary beings aspiring to enter the first bhumi. Here our aspiration was, may I always behold the Buddhas here before my eyes, and around them all their bodhisattva sons and daughters, without ever tiring throughout all the aeons to come. May the offerings I make them be endless and vast. Now 28, the beginning of this week. So now we're on the first bhumi, and indeed going on the bhumis. Now we can only see Sambhogakaya directly on the 8th bhumi. So here we're aspiring to behold and enter the Buddha fields through our miraculous power, which we've now acquired on the first bhumi. In a single atom may I see as many pure realms as atoms in the universe, and in each realm Buddhas beyond all imagining, encircled by all their bodhisattva heirs. Along with them may I perform the actions of enlightenment. Yeah, so here again, the verse has changed, right? We're now aspiring to see them with the vision of someone on the first bhumi, the path of seeing, and we're aspiring to actually perform the actions of enlightenment. And then on 34, now we're seeing from the 8th bhumi, this Sambhogakaya, on a single atom may I actually bring about the entire array of pure realms of past, of present and future, and then enter into those pure Buddha realms in each atom and in each and every direction. So this is likely all inconceivable to us now. I just wanted to point out that there is a progression here, and all we can say right now, as Rinpoche did, is that we should aspire to have the confidence that we will be able to see the bodhisattvas in the way that the sublime bodhisattvas are able to see them. Okay, verse 35, the last verse from this week, which is entering into the presence of the Buddhas. When those who illuminate the world still to come gradually attain Buddhahood, turn the wheel of Dharma, and demonstrate the final profound peace of Nirvana, may I be always in their presence. So here, as Rinpoche said, we're aspiring to enter into the realm of the Buddhas of the past, present and future directly in manifest form. Especially entering the realm or domain of future Buddhas, when they're generating bodhicitta or their own enlightened aspiration. And we pray that we will be able to pay homage and offer prostrations and make offerings as they do that. And likewise, as they engage in the path of accumulation and purification for 3 countless aeons. And of course, when they finally attain Buddhahood and turn the wheel of Dharma and enter parinirvana, we will also directly be there, go pay homage and make offerings. So with that, I'd like to just turn to some of Rinpoche's commentary on the 2 truths, which he taught in Vancouver this year, 2024, the example of falling from a building. And he said, this is kind of important. If you're having the nightmare of falling from a 26-story building, there is the whole act of the beginning of the fall, secondly, the duration or the middle of the fall, and then third, the end of the fall, perhaps breaking your hips or whatever. And during this, you'll be scared, you'll be panicked, all of that. Those cannot be denied. And during this period of falling, in other words, from the beginning of the fall until you've landed on the ground, during this period, we can talk about karma, bad karma, good karma, karma in general. But in reality, you're just lying asleep on your bed. You are not falling. So there is no beginning of the falling, middle of the falling, or end of the falling either. So as he said, can you see the reality of not falling, the ultimate truth, and the illusion of falling, the relative truth, can occur together? So this is why asking a Buddha or a Buddhist about whether everything is free will or predestination is difficult. Because if you believe in free will, then you're basically saying the fall in the dream is not a dream. And likewise, if you believe in predestination, it's the same thing. So he said this is a little difficult. It will take some time to get used to this logic. But the short answer is that in Buddhism, karma is neither free will nor predestination. Sometimes there might be the appearance of free will. At other times, it might appear to be already fixed. And so then he talked a little more about ultimate and relative truth. He's saying, this approach is perhaps a little Indian, so I'd like to go deeper into this and present the unique Indian way of constructing a theory. He said, I'm sorry if this is a little too technical for newer people, but you sort of have to bear with this because we're discussing an important text and I don't want to water it down into something simple like, may everyone just be happy and free from unhappiness. This text is so much more than that. And the analogy of the dream of falling from the 26th story of a building demonstrates how we construct a theory. So here there are 2 things, ultimate and relative. Ultimately you're not falling, but relatively you're falling. Now it's not as though these 2, ultimate and relative, are opposites, like one is in the east and one is in the west. They are one. But also you can't really say they're one, because even though you're not actually falling, you appear to be falling, you experience the falling. Here Rinpoche said, I don't know anything about Taoist teachings, but as I read some of the stanzas from the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, you can feel the thinking is very similar in lines like, the name that can be given is not a name. So you're almost talking about the ultimate, but then come all of these names like the relative. So going back to what we talked about previously, the bird's eye view. What is this bird's eye view? Remember, we're having a nightmare that we're falling right now, and we pray that when we fall, may we at least know that we're dreaming. Because when you see that, you can see the whole fall, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the fall, with a bird's eye view. And what does that do? As Rinpoche said, it does many things. If you're falling from a building and you know that you're really just dreaming, then you might want to take advantage of this dream experience. Perhaps you might look through the windows of people's apartments as you fall, because you know you're not going to break any limbs in reality anyway. So this combination of the ultimate truth and relative truth, in other words, knowing you're not really falling even though you experience falling, that's what we call understanding non-duality. In other words, bodhicitta, which is the key to aspiration. So going back to the dream, you're falling from the 26th floor. Let's suppose you pass the 20th floor where your friend is living, and your friend might be smoking on the balcony. And here, if you scream for help, saying, help, I'm falling, that's a bit like not having revulsion towards mundane worldly life. You're denying the ultimate reality. This is just a dream. That's easy to understand. But if your friend asks you, hey, what are you doing? And you say, well, actually nothing. I'm not really falling. You should try it. that's also failing to have revulsion, because now you're denying the relative experience of the dream. You fail to have revulsion or renunciation towards worldly life when you deny either the relative truth or the ultimate truth. And this is such a big thing for Buddhists, not to be extreme. And they will say you've become nihilist if you deny the relative truth, or eternalist if you deny the ultimate truth. So when we say, may I always have renunciation mind, yes, of course, we should have renunciation towards carpets, gold rings, whatever, but also renunciation and revulsion towards all values, liberal values, fascist values, all values. And that's much more difficult than renouncing a carpet, Rinpoche said, I'm telling you, because your values are your character, and character is so important to us. A big part of our identity is our values. So may I always be able to renounce my identity and my values. So in reality, nobody is falling, but relatively there is the perception of falling, and therefore there is fear. And because there is fear, there is wish to be free from this fear. And in one way, you could say this wish to be free from fear is the seed of aspiration. Although ironically, the cause of this fear is unfounded, because in reality it is just an illusion. But nevertheless, if someone's having a nightmare, it doesn't do any good for you to go to their dream and tell them, you know, you're just dreaming, because unless the person is ready to hear and contemplate what you're saying, it won't do any good. So at times, it's also good to go along with the story of their dream. Likewise, there's a famous verse in the Madhyamakavatara by Chandrakirti where he says, unless a person is ready to hear the teachings on emptiness directly, we should not try to teach them emptiness directly. We should teach them the gradual path. We should go along with the story of their dream. And Rinpoche added, because this is a Mahayana text, we're also talking about helping everyone else awaken from their dreams as well. To make things a little complicated, because we might say, well, if this is my dream and that is their dream, Buddha himself said he cannot wipe away your suffering, you have to do it yourself. So what is this idea of clearing everyone's dreams away? How can you take responsibility of awakening others? This makes things a little complex. So we're always going to be talking about these two, relative and ultimate, at times as one, at times as different, and it's always going to be challenging. As Rinpoche said, many of the questions stem from this. And hypothetically, you might say Buddhists don't even like these questions. There's one sutra where there's a list of 14 questions that the Buddha never really answered, although actually his not answering was the answer, which many people actually misinterpreted as a sort of no answer. But that not answering was the answer. For example, one of the questions was, when did everything begin? That's a tricky question, because the question of beginning alludes to an original genesis. Then you're talking about ultimate truth, in the beginning, the real thing. And Buddhists don't like that. Remember the person falling from the building? The beginning of the fall is like that. It actually never really happened. There is no beginning of the fall. The beginning of the fall can only be talked about just because we see the ground beneath. And when teaching Uttara Tantra, Rinpoche said, yes, although ultimately there is no beginning or end, relatively and individually there is indeed enlightenment and an end to our defilements. Even though relatively and individually we can say there's no beginning. And you might ask, how can that be? Rinpoche said the relative is like that. It's completely irrational. Don't analyze it too much or it will fall apart. When we talk purely from the Buddha nature's point of view, there is no beginning and no end. But as soon as we talk about confusion, we talk about a path, and that is relative truth. There's no such thing as all sentient beings one day clearing all the dirt from their window, because that would be the end of samsara. And there is no such thing as that. There's no big end, because then you're talking about ultimate truth again. But individually, a practitioner can clean their window and they can experience the relative end, but only on the relative level. And that's how it is. And he said that's a very good understanding for now. Basically, we have the logic of cause, condition, and effect. And then we have the logic of Buddha nature, which is beyond cause, condition, and effect. But to think about or talk about these two ways together is difficult. Because on the one hand, we're talking about the glass itself, pre-dirty and pre-clean. But on the other hand, we talk about the dirt. And after we talk about dirt, we can talk about cleaning and the clean window post-dirt. But it's meaningless to talk about a clean window if there's no dirt, even though we might see the window as clean from our perspective. As Rinpoche said, from the window's point of view, there is no difference between dirt and no dirt, because the dirt is simply not part of the window. The window glass is pre-dirty and pre-clean. From the perspective of the window, none of this has anything to do with dirty and clean. It's just pure dirt, pure glass. So, going back to the confidence of seeing Buddhas there now, not in the future. Here, again, we talk about enlightenment or Buddhahood as the result of elimination, which is a Tibetan word, Djelje. Basically means the clean glass, the clean window was there already. It's currently covered with dirt. We clean the dirt to reveal the clean glass that was already there. Likewise, our Buddha nature is already there. It's just covered over with emotions, obscurations, defilements, and so we don't see it. It does not manifest. It does not function for us. Rinpoche said, the Mahasandi people have very good words for this, such as primordially pure, kadak, primordially eliminated, perhaps you could say. But we can't use these words now, as this is a Mahayana teaching. And also, words like primordially pure can cause a lot of misunderstanding. So that's why terms like result of elimination, Djelje, is actually a very good term, especially for those of us following the Mahayana path. The nature of beings is primordially pure, and that's why we call it Buddha nature. And although emotions are seemingly apparent and seemingly stubborn, seemingly almost like a second nature, they never are a second nature. They're like clouds. They're adventitious. They're not you. And this point is very important. In Buddhism, we always conclude that emotions and defilements are temporary. We might be looking at a grey, cloudy sky, and we might call it a cloudy sky, but it's not really a cloudy sky. The clouds are never the sky. And likewise, the Uttara Tantra Shastra describes 4 paradoxes, the third of which is that even though all the qualities of the Buddha, such as the 10 powers, the 32 major marks, the 80 minor marks, even though these exist within ordinary beings all the time, without increase, decrease, or change, nevertheless we don't see them. For example, we do not see ourselves or other sentient beings with an ushnisha on the top of their head. Likewise, one of the 80 minor marks is the Buddha's lips are as red as the bimpa, which is a very special tropical fruit. These qualities are there all the time, but we don't see them. So the Shantongpa masters would say these effects of maturation, like the 32 major marks and 80 minor marks, are there right from the beginning, and not even a single lock of the Buddha's hair can be produced. But the Rangtongpa masters would say they need to be cultivated, and we cultivate them through aspiration. For example, when the Buddha was a bodhisattva, he engaged in prayers and aspiration. And likewise, when we generate devotion, aspiration, pure vision, then we begin to see these qualities. We begin to see reality as it is. So removing the dirt is our aim during the path, hence we call the result of elimination. Of course, it seems to imply there's something there you need to eliminate, but actually it was never there in the first place. The window was never dirty. And likewise, we have the question, well, if Buddha nature is beyond all words, all concepts, all distinctions, including those between good and bad, clean and dirty and so forth, why do we say enlightenment is good? Why do we say it is clean? Why should virtue be preferable to non-virtue? And here Rinpoche said, well, actually it isn't. He said, I would dare to say this. Of course, during the path, when we talk about virtue, we're referring to something auspicious and without pain, so we prefer the word virtue. But from the point of view of absolute truth, you cannot say that Buddha nature is good or bad. But when we talk about the qualities on the path, I guess we have to say Buddha nature is good rather than saying it is bad. And indeed, we can say it is good because the bad can be removed and the good cannot be removed, which is why it's called Buddha nature. But likewise, We may say Buddha nature is pure, but that transcendent purity is not clean in the ordinary sense of clean, but something that transcends the idea of clean and not clean. Yeah. But one of the functions of our Buddha nature is that we feel revulsion towards suffering. And so we can say, because there is Buddha nature, we have this longing, we have this aspiration for peace, for happiness, for enlightenment. And hence, even though in reality there is nothing pure or impure, nevertheless, given our current awareness and experience, we prefer pure over impure. Likewise, Rinpoche said, when we talk to ordinary beings, there are teachings that describe the appearance of Vairocana Buddha as like an ocean of snowy mountains. He's a very big Buddha. And somehow in the minds of ordinary people, big is appreciated more than small. But of course the Buddha has no preference. There are no extremes of big and small. But when ordinary people talk about these things, we like to describe Buddha in terms of best rather than worst. And so we tend to think that in terms of big and small, maybe big is better than small. And then, as we think about cleaning the window, the glass which is there beneath all the dirt, we might ask, is the window glass permanent? And that's a good question, because the definition of permanent here is when there is no beginning, no middle and end. The window that is pre-dirty and pre-clean is free from beginning, middle and end of clean and of dirty. So you can call it impermanent or permanent, it doesn't really matter. Just like the example of falling from the building. So there was a question, we must practice the pure view, but how can we do this in everyday life? For example, seeing the Guru as the Buddha, beings as deities, the land as a pure land is so hard to visualize. For example, if we see someone that we know is a criminal or a liar, how are we supposed to see them as pure? How are we supposed to see their Buddha nature? If we see a pure land, how can we know if this is really a pure land or just our mind's projection? And here Rinpoche said, first you have to hear that everybody has the Buddha nature. You have to hear this again and again, then contemplate and then meditate. Then you will become courageous and you will obtain loving kindness. You will no longer have inferiority or superiority and all the other things we've discussed. Now to the last part of the question, how to know it is not a projection, how to know what is real. Rinpoche said, if you know that is your projection, that is already real. And that's probably about all we can say for now. But there is continuous manifestation all the time. And when we say the manifestations of the Nirmanakaya do not run out, you might think it's like a river flowing all the time, something continuous. But even continuous is not really the right word, because that tends to mean lots of things continuing one after the other, a bit like a mala or rosary with a single string and many beads. By contrast, the Buddha is there. And Rinpoche said, His Holiness Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche used the example of a crystal, which refracts rainbow light when you hold it up to the sun. And if you hide it for 1,000 years, there is no rainbow. But if after 1,000 years you hold it up to the sun, then suddenly all the rainbows are there again. The rainbows do not get confused. They are already there. So back to Vancouver, Rinpoche said, it's really good that you're asking these questions. It really means that actually my whole purpose of agreeing to teach the Pranidhana Raja is working out. He said, I'm happy it has really confused you guys. Because all these things, beginning, end, Genesis, Armageddon, all these are as arbitrary as talking about the beginning of the dream, when I just fell from the 26th floor, and now I'm slowly falling past the 20th floor. It's like that. But also, we can't dismiss our experience. There is real pain. It's a nightmare. There's sweating, screaming, sleepwalking, everything. Nightmare, samsara, whatever you want to call it. Rinpoche said, I hope you realize that Buddhism in general and Mahayana in particular has a different way of looking at the world. And even if you only hear it intellectually, that's good. It will really change your perspective. Even if the only thing this makes you realize is that everything that you say is vague. So here he held up a red rose and said, even just saying the rose is red, every part of that sentence is vague. Red, rose, even the word is. What a tragedy. Yeah, so now just apply this to everything, all your values, all that you treasure, all the things you dislike. But then the Mahayana will say, well, you don't even have to apply this to everything. That's wasting your time. Just go to the root of it. The I, that thing that's from the 26th floor to the ground. Rinpoche said, can I believe it? It's been with me for 62 years, and I'm sure somewhere a great bodhisattva is laughing at me. 62? That's nothing. What about billions and billions of lifetimes before, when you were a spider, when you were a bug, when you spoke a totally different language? And so with that, let's just review the main theme of this week's verses once again, namely aspiring to see the qualities and activities of the Buddhas from the perspective of the bodhisattvas who've reached the path of seeing. And as Rinpoche said, we need to develop the confidence to see the Buddhas right here and right now. Countless Buddhas and bodhisattvas on top of every atom, which requires vast aspiration. Also, we need confidence and trust that enlightenment is possible and that our current perception is not yet enlightened. We saw this with the example of cleaning the dirty window. As Rinpoche said, we need to have the confidence the window can be cleaned. And this is something where we can develop an intellectual understanding and then gradually extend it into experience and finally realization. But we also need acceptance that the view of non-dual awareness, in other words, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, the fullness of infinite Buddhas and bodhisattvas, this isn't something we can really talk meaningfully about. We can only point at it indirectly, like a finger pointing at the moon. And here we need to go beyond our ordinary rationality, our ordinary habit of relating to the world with thought and language. But nevertheless, this isn't something completely beyond us. We can experience it. So let us rejoice if we're feeling a bit confused by what it means to see the Buddhas and understand the two truths, as this was Rinpoche's aspiration. So let me close with a couple of stories from the Zen tradition, which I think encapsulate what we're talking about this week. The first one is called Is That So? A beautiful girl in the village was pregnant. Her angry parents demanded to know who the father was. At first, resistant to confess, the frightened girl eventually pointed out Hakuin, the Zen master whom everyone previously revered for living a pure life. And when the outraged parents confronted Hakuin with their daughter's accusation, he simply responded, "Is that so?" And when the child was born, the parents brought the baby to Hakuin, who was now viewed as a pariah by the village. He willingly accepted the child, taking very good care of the baby. A year later, the girl remorsefully confessed that the real father was a young man in the village whom she tried to protect. The parents went to Hakuin to apologize and ask for forgiveness. They also came to take the baby back. Hakuin willingly yielded the child, simply saying, "Is that so?" And the second story is called The Moon That Cannot Be Stolen. Ryokan, a Zen master, lived the simplest kind of life in a little hut at the foot of a mountain. And one evening a thief visited the hut, only to discover there was nothing to steal. Ryokan returned and caught him. "You may have come a long way to visit me," he told the prowler, "and you should not return empty-handed. Please take my clothes as a gift." The thief was bewildered, but he took the clothes and slunk away. Ryokan sat naked, watching the moon. "Poor fellow," he mused. "I wish I could have given him this beautiful moon." And so with that, let us take a moment to dedicate the merit. And thank you for joining this week, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week.